at 131.84.2. Okay, 131.84.2. Let's see and let's wait.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
Short position opened on British pound at 131.84.2.
Another grim milestone, global virus deaths jump by the most on record. Cases worldwide top 52 million, markets head lower. Recovery derailed, the UK economy sees record growth, but the rebound leaves it far behind its peers as a new lockdown looks set to bite. And President-elect Biden starts to name his cabinet. Ron Klain will be his chief of staff, one of the most powerful roles in Washington. Biden says bringing the pandemic under control is his top priority. Well, good morning, everyone. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lack in London, Tom Keene in New York. Tom, very important to look at the treasury markets and kind of follow that rotation that we saw to see where it ends up. We look at, of course, politics in the U.S., the transition period, which I have to say is pretty bewildering if you're looking at it from the outside.
Yeah.
And then we look at the U.K. and oil.
Well said. It is bewildering, and trust me, I'm a political junkie on this, Francine, and I'm as confused as you are. I know we've got a guest here in a couple of minutes that maybe will provide clarity. The 10-year yield, the data check here, we'll do it in a minute. The yield comes in a little bit off Veterans Day yesterday in America with the bond market shut down. But Francine, I'm not going to mince words. There is no other backstory in America right now than the pandemic. It has pushed everything aside, including this election.
Yeah, I agree. So we'll have plenty more, of course, on that. Let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Morning, Francine. Tom, the state of Georgia will conduct a hand recount of ballots for the presidential race. Joe Biden leads President Trump by a slim margin of about 14,000 votes out of roughly 5 million cast. The Trump campaign has alleged there were widespread voting irregularities, but it's offered no proof. President-elect Joe Biden has named longtime aide Ron Klain to be White House Chief of Staff. Klain played a leading role during the economic and public health crises of the Obama administration. The job is one of the most powerful in Washington. The person is the gatekeeper for the president. And Moderna is now poised to take the spotlight on a coronavirus vaccine. The company says its study has accumulated more than 53 infections that will allow a preliminary analysis of its effectiveness to begin. Moderna didn't predict how long it could take an independent monitoring committee to analyze the data. The International Energy Agency has cut forecasts.
I also place an order to buy British pound at the price 131.84.8. New order placed to buy at the price 184.8. Okay, see.
jettisoning prime brokerage, and BNP picked that up as well. Now, Bloomberg has learned that BNP Paribas, in that transaction with Deutsche Bank, is being scrutinized. That's the language we're using, scrutinized by French regulators over a fee to a middleman. It will go on to say this involves a former Goldman Sachs banker. I guess, Francine, you could have asked Mr. Note about that. That would have made him happy. But there you are as the French look at this. Francine, what does it mean when we scrutinize?
Well, it means that, innocent until proven guilty, but it certainly looks like an investigation, Tom, right? This is probably how I would characterize it. And again, if it's the French regulators, I guess we just have to wait and see. And I know our reporters will call to try and figure out if there's anything more, but we'll know certainly from the regulators in a couple of weeks what that report found. Could be nothing. It could be significant. Again, some of the biggest things start from nothing.
The order to buy was cancelled. Moved too fast, too far. I'm cancelling the order to buy British pound. So we have only one short position on British pound and one at 131.84.2.
The yield was a 9.97 before Veterans Day. We come in a solid 3 basis points, 0.94, much more normative there. Oil ebbs away. Fractionally, I'm just going down in flames here, Francine. You got to save me. Sterling, 131.97. Save me.
You know what? I'm saving you by also showing you Burberry.
There we go. There's a data check that matters.
Spot. The figure, I mean, look, sales weren't great, but actually it was better than expected. So sales dropped less than expected, and you can see Burberry gaining some almost 3%. It was gaining at some point more than 6%, but it's very clear that the global stocks rally is easing, investors assessing whether the equity markets had overheated, and this with the backdrop, Tom, of a deteriorating coronavirus situation.
And your final data point there, Francine, is a reversible check and monogram cashmere scarf from Burberry, pricing in at $620. I can see it under the liquid.
3 standard deviations.
Three standard deviations.
Let's talk about U.S. politics. President-elect
Leslie's
Joe
taking
Biden
notes. What's it called?
Joe Biden has been named, or has named, long-term aide Ron Klain as his White House chief of staff. Meanwhile, the Republican senator from Oklahoma, James Lankford, says he'll intervene if the Trump administration denies Biden access to daily intelligence briefings by the end of the week. Well, joining us now to discuss the transition, to discuss what the future of a Biden administration actually brings is Leslie Vinjamuri, Chatham House, head of the U.S. and America's program. Leslie, thank you once again for making us wiser on the world of U.S. politics. When you look at the transition, so you have the Biden camp basically, trying to take charge going ahead, and you still have from people in government saying we need recounts, this is not done. I mean, how does a common person actually deal with these two sides?
Well, I think at some level it's probably what many people expected from President Trump, not one to take bad news well. But as the numbers come in, it's very clear how decisive the electoral result has been. Recounts for slim margins are not uncommon, but of course these aren't slim margins. We're talking about 20,000 in Wisconsin, something shy of that in Georgia. So what the Biden campaign, the Biden team is doing now is very wisely moving forward, trying to communicate. As Tom said, the number one story right now is the pandemic, the devastation it's wreaking. And the Biden team is clearly communicating its commitment to moving forward, to giving a steady message on masks, appointing that coronavirus task force. And Ron Klain, of course, dealt with Ebola for President Obama, really understands the significance of this and has worked with Biden, has helped him for 30 years. He's very well known, very well trusted. So I think the signals that are coming out of the Biden team are all good ones. And they are, waiting to be given the key so that they can go into the executive branch and begin that process of transition. And thank goodness that this is a team of people who know Washington, who know the executive branch, who know the issues very, very well. If it was a newcomer to Washington, the fact that they're being held up by the Trump administration would be far more worrying than it currently is.
Leslie, what have we found out about who will surround the president-elect Joe Biden? Do we have any insight into who he'll have in his administration?
Well, he has indicated that he's going to wait until Thanksgiving. I think the presents are coming slowly. For those who are very curious to know, I think we all have the list of names in our mind of who we think we're likely to see. Of course, he's released the information on the transition teams. So that's something that people are poring over. But I think a lot of people are assuming that the Secretary of State pick is going to be Susan Rice or Senator Coons, Michelle Flournoy in defense. Lael Brainerd seems to be the favorite in Treasury. So I think the names are fairly, they're in circulation, but of course things can change, and one eye is always going to be on the Senate and what happens in that January 5th set of runoffs in Georgia. And remember that, the very important point on those January 5th runoffs is that it means that effectively the Republican Party and also the Democrats are in campaign mode all the way through January 5th. And that's certainly going to affect what happens in Congress. It might mean that we don't get any fiscal stimulus until after January 5th and after January 20th, which of course is not good news and probably wasn't good news for the Democrats if you look at what's happened in the House.
Leslie, let me bring up the question of the day, and this goes back to Mr. Klain. Full disclosure, folks, I've interviewed him a number of times. Okay, Ron Klain is a brilliant kid out of Indiana, worked with Al Gore, et cetera, et cetera. He was instrumental in getting Ruth Bader Ginsburg through the process to become a Supreme Court justice. Great. The first question that's going to be asked is Mr. Biden piecing together Obama 2. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that, if you're a president-elect looking at a country where hundreds of thousands of Americans have died and thousands are dying every single day, and there's no plan for getting the country back into control, where you're facing rising geopolitical challenges from China and others, and any number of issues, and 4 years of wrecking by President Trump on any number of democratic norms. What you don't want is to start with people who don't really understand Washington, who don't have the experience, who don't have the context. So certainly a number of people with deep experience are coming back on board. It looks like a very moderate team. We're not seeing progressives rise to the top of the list so far. We'll have to wait and see. But I think also, most of the names that are coming up are experienced, but very much on the front foot with respect to their focus, their energy. So I think it's good news.
Leslie, Mr. Langford of Oklahoma, deeply devout, a true evangelical, there's no other way to put it, has made very clear this president-elect needs an intelligent briefing. Is Mr. Trump starting to lose his absolute core conservative base when you hear Senator Langford say, let's go?
Well, I think this is the question, and this is the judgment that people like Mitch McConnell and others in the Senate must need to make very soon. At what point are they holding back America's progress of the transition beyond a moment where their supporters are going to find this advantageous? And as the numbers unfold, as the rest of the world begins to really acknowledge and accept the president-elect, Vice President Biden, as the American public moves forward, I think at some point this is going to cost the Republicans quite a lot. But again, it's that calculation. What do you do to keep the base mobilized, to keep energy around the party leading up to the January 5th elections in Georgia? Because, of course, control of the Senate is at stake, and that's incredibly important for the domestic agenda.
Leslie, thank you so much. Leslie Vinjamuri there from Chatham House, head of U.S. and the Americas program. Now, up next, we speak with Jane Foley, Rabobank head of FX strategy. We'll talk, of course, about the election and what happens to dollar. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Now, joining us to talk about U.S. and, of course, to talk about everything else is Jane Foley, Rabobank head of FX strategy. Jane, I know Tom, who's been very upfront, actually, dominating really some of the Turkish lira moves ahead of them, wants to talk Turkey. But what does the Joe Biden election, what does vaccine actually mean for dollar going forward?
Well, I mean, I think particularly with the vaccine, it is good news. Now, it's quite interesting because we have seen since Monday and that Pfizer news, we've seen a lot of politicians and central bankers, begin to push back, say, look, we're in for a couple of bad quarters still, a really difficult winter, both from a health perspective in Europe and the US, and of course, economically too. And yet, what we've seen, I think, from the markets really since the global financial crisis and that advent of huge amounts of quantitative easing and cheap money is the market's ability to be sensitive to bad news is sort of cushioned. The blanket of cheap money is provide exactly that, a safety blanket. And the market tends to look through bad news perhaps a lot swifter, a lot quicker than it would have done before the global financial crisis. So I think the market has a tendency to ignore the fact that we do have a couple of bad quarters, price in perhaps a better time ahead. Yes, there's been a little bit of position adjustment since the movement, that rotation on Monday, Tuesday, but I think it probably means that the likelihood we're going to see a big surge in the safe haven dollar is now far less likely.
What do you do with some of the other havens, Jane? What do you do with Swissy? What do you do with yen?
Well, for dollar yen, I think it's just going to hold around 105 now for quite a while. I think one thing that's really quite interesting, and perhaps the market might have mispriced, is a relationship between perhaps Biden and China. The market consensus is that the relationship between China and the US in this presidency won't get worse, perhaps at least not until we come up for the next US election in 4 years' time. And if there's a play by the electorate, suspicions by the electorate towards China, maybe then he'll become more hawkish. But actually, looking at the conversations that Biden had yesterday between the prime ministers of Japan and the prime ministers of Australia, they appear to be trying to make him come out and make his stance about defense in the region. And this, of course, is particularly worrisome to them, to Asian countries, the build-up of military hardware in China, for instance. And that might mean that we have some pressure on the president to actually make clear his stance about China, perhaps sooner than the market is anticipating, and perhaps he could be more hawkish.
Jane, I want to talk about the move we've seen in Pacific Rim EM. I mean, seen off ADXY, but just looking at dollar Sing dollar, dollar Taiwan, and the rest of them, they're riding two standard deviations of persistent move to stronger EM currencies. Does that sustain, or do you just assume a regression to the mean where they go weaker at some point?
I think for the time being, I think with the Biden upswing and with the vaccine upswing, it's not a move that I'd really want to stand in the way of right now. Certainly, it does seem that there's been a big push back into EM, and then actually data is suggesting that we began to see that really last month, a big move back into EM last month. People again taking a look and moving back into to higher risk assets, and that perhaps is in tune with that rotation trade that we saw in stock markets on Monday as well. So unless we saw risk appetite really taking a dive for the worse, I think that's a move that perhaps is going to be comfortably here for the time being. Now, the vaccine hope, as I say, it does give a big insulating, a big push to that risk on trade. And yes, they're going to be risk off day, certainly, but I think that the market move is certainly more positive now.
Euro goes 117 to 121. Europe gets a little upset over trade dynamics. Do these EM nations, these Pacific Rim nations rather, do they get upset about strong currency, or do they just take it as it comes?
I think they would probably rather have weaker currencies. I mean, we're in an environment where inflation is really quite low, or very low in many respects. In that environment, I think we can take it as a given that generally speaking, central banks, economies would like to have or favor a weaker currency to try and get inflation back on track. And aside from that, there is this big push of trying to perhaps relocate some businesses out of China back into the Asian region. There will be some competition between some of those nations are trying to get some of that business, that onshoring business, for instance. So from that point of view, a softer exchange rate may work in their favor. So for a majority of countries right now, we're certainly not talking about Turkey here, but a weaker currency would be to their advantage as long, of course, as it was controlled.
Jane Foley with us with Rabobank. Lots to talk here about the deepest market, arguably the litmus paper of the international system on foreign exchange. And we'll continue this conversation with her at the beginning of the next half hour. Right now, futures at -3, Dow futures -130. A churn, NASDAQ futures go positive the other way. And other than that, it's remarkably quiet. Lira actually right now flighty, but weaker, stronger Turkish lira. On Balance of Power with David Weston, Mr. Tarullo, the former Federal Reserve Board governor. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And so we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
Give you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Rishka Gupta with your Bloomberg Business Flash. China's ByteDance has asked the Trump administration to extend today's deadline to sell its TikTok business in the U.S. In August, President Trump demanded that the app be spun off because of concern about American users' personal information. TikTok has struck a deal to sell part of its business to Oracle and Walmart, but the deal isn't final. Siemens is forecasting a modest increase for growth in 2021 after a tough year for industrial companies due to the pandemic. Still, Europe's biggest engineering firm warns that some coronavirus-related challenges remain that could cause customer investments to lag behind economic growth. Wells Fargo is considering whether to sell another of its businesses. Bloomberg's learned the bank is exploring the sale of a unit offering store-branded credit cards. Wells Fargo also is gauging interest in other businesses, such as asset manager and its student loan portfolio. And that's your latest Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom, Francine.
Vertica, thank you so much. Now let's look at the markets. The market's definitely focusing on the rotation that we saw and treasuries after a closed day yesterday back. So I'm looking at Treasury 09390 and Burberry. Tom, this was quite significant because sales were down a lot, but actually it was better than expected. And so on the back of that, you saw Burberry bounce back quite nicely, now gaining some 3.2%. Overall, the million-dollar question or gazillion-dollar question European stocks is, did the rally go too far, and actually, were markets overheated? I think that's the main question that markets have been trying to figure out over the last 2 days or so.
Well, we saw yesterday maybe a return to the kind of dynamics we saw previous, but we'll have to see here day by day, to say the least. The data here, red and green on the screen. The VIX 23.74 speaks volumes as we come in from a 41 level as well. On dollar weakness, with Jane Foley with us, we'll get back to her in a moment. Yen 105.32, Euro 118.12. It'll be really interesting to talk to her about Euro dynamics as we just looked at the Pacific Rim. And I'd also want to point out, maybe we'll touch on Turkish lira as well. On the diplomacy of the United States with Turkey, there's no one better to speak with than Robert Hormats of Tiedemann Advisors, the former ambassador on the changing of the guard in Washington. Robert Hormats on our new diplomacy. Please stay with us worldwide. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
doesn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Now, Tom, the UK economy recovered some of the ground lost to lockdowns in the third quarter. Its recovery, though, much weaker than other wealthy nations, highlighting the toll that the pandemic has taken on Britain. Well, joining us now to talk about that, to talk about Brexit, is Therese Raphael of Bloomberg Opinion. First of all, Therese, congratulations on, I think, one of our most read opinion pieces, which laid out on why you thought millennials would get the vaccine or should get the vaccine first. But if we move on from that, maybe we'll come back to it. What is Boris Johnson's biggest headache right now? Is it the economy? Is it Brexit? Or it seems there's so much talk also about things in Downing Street not going to plan, with aides leaving and aides joining.
Yeah, I think this morning his biggest headache is very close to home. For some time now, we've been hearing that the Prime Minister wants to appoint a chief of staff, and it emerged in the British media that his choice was Lee Cain, a very long-standing advisor who'd been with him at the Foreign Office and had been with him through his rise in Downing Street and his election majority in December. That was not to the liking of others in his party, and Lee Cain has now resigned, and that's created a big storm. Now, the government has said, look, there's nothing to see here. This is just a bit of reshuffling of the chairs within Downing Street. It's a communications job. This is not really what the public want to hear. It's not what they care about. But actually, it goes to the heart of what many people have questioned about this government, and that is, who's driving it, what is the vision behind it, and where is the real sort of management expertise. So I think we are going to see this story have some cut through with the public, even if there are so many, ostensibly bigger issues, the economy, the vaccine, the relationship with the new White House, that are also, vying for attention right now.
Therese, what does this exit in Downing Street actually mean for probably the most controversial but also closest ally and advisor to Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings?
Yeah, well, that's an open question. Cummings has hung on through a lot of ups and downs, including huge criticism when he broke lockdown rules before, and he's very close to Lee Cain. And I think the question that this raises is whether this very core group of hardcore Brexiters that formed the Vote Leave campaign that really propelled Johnson to office and into his position of power, whether their influence over the government is waning now. And a lot depends, I think, on how this plays out in the backbenches of the Tory party. So Johnson is often accused of not doing enough to help MPs keep them informed of his policy, help them understand what he wants, bring them along and get their support. And I think we're going to have to look at how MPs respond to this and whether we see a backlash really against Cummings rising up out of this Cain resignation as well.
Therese, I'm fascinated by this as an outsider, and of course you bring over the equivalencies to the White House and what the First Lady would do. I was reading the Telegraph, and they do it in a more, political way than your elegance and all that. And they've got Team Vote Leave, and they've got Team Carrie for Carrie Simmons. I believe that's how you pronounce it. What is Carrie Simmons doing, intruding on this process, as they say at the bottom of the Telegraph article, because she got upset about photos being posted on Instagram? The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom's dealing with this?
Well, I think there's, so much going on behind the scenes here, Tom. We also have the appointment of a new communications head for Johnson, and Allegra Stratton, who used to work for Rishi Sunak. And was also apparently not happy with the Cain appointment. So, you've got obviously various factions within Downing Street. And the important point, I think, for those of us who care about Brexit and the economy and the vaccine, is who has the most influence over Boris Johnson? Who is controlling access to Johnson? What is their vision? And right now, that's not clear. And that's why this internal spat over a head of communications is actually a much bigger story than you might first meet the eye.
I agree, but what is the response of the Prime Minister, or is it unknowable right now?
Well, I think we will have to wait and see what the Prime Minister himself says. And, maybe it says something that he hasn't spoken up more on this so far. So, he's going to try to keep the focus on his policies. But, one indication of how worried they are was when you had, a government minister on BBC this morning saying we should be focused on, the growth figures, which are pretty dismal right now. And I think when the government is telling us to look at dismal economic figures, they are very uncertain about what's going on within Downing Street now. So, this is still playing out. We don't have a new chief of staff announced yet. And the person that takes over that position is going to tell us a lot about the direction of this government, Tom.
As the world turns with Therese Raphael, thank you so much. Bloomberg Opinion, just absolutely extraordinary to read some of this, folks, and to try to make sense of it from a distance. Let's get back to something predictable like the foreign exchange market. Jane Foley with us with Rabobank. Jane, I want to look at euro here. We did have a bout up to, I believe, a 119. And, as a major pair with some huge dynamics on the continent of Europe. Let's just start with square one. What's the fair value of euro right now? The appropriate level of euro is calculated by Rabobank?
I think we're settling, quite close to it. And to be honest, I think in the months ahead, we will see perhaps less volatility than we've seen so far this year. But maybe we're going to see something like a 116, 120 range. I mean, I know you cited 117, 121 a little bit earlier on, but I think perhaps a little bit lower. We still have, of course, in December, that important ECB meeting coming up. I think for Euro bulls, that might be a little bit difficult. The market is long euro already, and I think that position could be a little bit under pressure ahead of that ECB meeting. Everyone's expecting more policy stimulus, but a large part of the dust settling, I think, for euro dollar will be trying to work out, what is the direction of the dollar under Biden, under the vaccine sort of news, but also I think there is still a lot to be digested in the eurozone. So, for instance, if we look back into the spring, if we look back into May, one of the reasons that the euro fundamentals were perceived as being really improved was that big step forward that European politicians took with the recovery fund. And yet, of course, as we move into this quarter, yes, this week they took a step forward in agreeing structure for their budget, but there's still a lot of detail to be thrashed out with the recovery fund. And meanwhile, we have countries like Italy having to pledge more fiscal response, but already, the weight of debt is hanging over the Italian government, and there could be a lot of fiscal pressures in the mix over the winter, which may not do too well for the euro. So I think, given the market is long, I don't think we're gonna really breach that 120 level. I think we'll see position adjustment profit taken every time we go up close to that level.
Jane, what happens to euro if there's a vaccine quicker than expected?
Well, clearly that's going to really help the market look through what is likely to be a very painful winter in terms of Eurozone growth and the amount of cases that we're seeing in Europe right now. But on the other hand, I think it's going to be something which really asks the question about, well, what happens to the dollar? Because the dollar, after all, is behaving mostly as a safe haven in this year. And therefore, we can expect perhaps that the dollar will soften. But that said, on the other hand, the market may begin to look at the dollar in a more constructive way if Biden puts together his task force, if he starts to really thrash out a better plan with respect to coronavirus over the winter for the US economy. So I think there's a huge amount of factors in the mix, and that's why I think we're going to bounce around perhaps between 116 and 120 for the next few months as the market really does begin to find its feet in these new sort of regimes, and as it looks ahead to the vaccine era and it looks ahead to the Biden era.
Brexit disruption is arriving, Jane, at your end, and if you speak to a lot of chief executives or industry lobbies, they'll say that the disruption will come even if we find a deal, just because in certain parts of the economy they're not ready for it. What does this mean for pound?
I think it means it's still going to be political clouds ahead in the following year for the pound. It is quite interesting because if we look perhaps at the deal that the market was hoping for in terms of the EU-UK trade deal, perhaps 2 or so years ago, the market was expecting perhaps there'd be something quite comprehensive. Now we think, well, look, if there is a deal in November, it's likely to be a skeleton deal, something that perhaps will impact some of the manufacturing sector, but perhaps leave large swathes of the services sector a little bit exposed. So that's going to mean that any deal, whilst it might create a little bit of a relief rally in sterling, that relief rally is going to be short-lived and perhaps, really won't run very far, particularly when everyone's expecting large queues of lorries at the borders come January the 1st, with confusion perhaps for lots of different industries. And then, of course, we go ahead to what is perhaps going to be a very difficult new year for Boris Johnson. The public tired of all of these policy U-turns, tired of all the headlines that we're seeing in the newspapers like today, that the pressure between MPs and Downing Street. And, the question ultimately is that will Boris Johnson remain in his job for another year or so? And that's very difficult to answer right now.
Jane Foley, thank you so much with Rabobank this morning. And Therese Raphael, thank you so much as well with Bloomberg Opinion. With our news in New York City, our first word news, here's Radhika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. President Trump suffered 2 setbacks as he tried to claim victory in the state of Arizona. The state's Republican Attorney General told Fox Business it was highly unlikely the president would catch up when remaining ballots are counted. He also said he has found no evidence of widespread fraud that the Trump campaign has alleged. President-elect Joe Biden has stocked his transition team with policy experts, academics, and former Obama administration officials. That's a contrast with the industry-friendly figures that President Trump appointed. Biden's team includes people who favor stronger government regulation than the current administration. Still, liberals are concerned about the number of tech executives Biden has included. The American pandemic's longest increase in coronavirus infections appears poised to get even longer. The nationwide rise in cases is now in its 9th week. Authorities reported more than 145,000 new cases yesterday, an all-time high. And the 7-day average for deaths has climbed above 1,000 for the first time since August. Global News 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Radhika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine Tom.
Radhika, thanks so much. Now join us next week for Bloomberg's New Economy Forum. We can watch live on Bloomberg TV, the Terminal, and the Bloomberg New Economy social channels on Twitter and Facebook. We'll, of course, focus on China. We'll focus on multilateralism going forward. We have a great set of exclusive interviews. This is Bloomberg.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
way to well over 200,000 cases a day. Our healthcare system's already overwhelmed in many locations in the country, and that is only going to continue to increase as these new numbers add up. And they are, in a sense, you might say, already in the pipeline if we don't have some immediate action for people to distance themselves from sharing air with other people, which I don't see happening. So we're going to have a serious crisis, much more than we've had already, just within the next, weeks to months.
Maybe the abrupt shift that we've already seen from Trump to Biden there. Mr. Osterholm, Dr. Osterholm, his book, Deadliest Enemy, is definitive on the virulency of the pandemic viruses and also, of course, on bacteria as well. He will be part of that task force. Right now, our task force in pharmacology, always led by Sam Fazili of Bloomberg Intelligence. Sam, a small item yesterday in the zeitgeist, which is all these fancy drugs are rich world drugs. Peter Hotez of Baylor Medicine has been on the show adamant that the poorer parts of the world need cheap, traditional pharmacology. Which is it, or do we do both?
Hi, Tom. So I think he's hit the nail on the head there. You know, it might be possible for us to organize the distribution of a vaccine that needs a minus 70 degrees, 94 Fahrenheit, storage around the US and Europe, but I'm sure you can't really do that to the majority of the world where the large part of the global population live. So you're going to need to have vaccines that just need basic fridges.
What is the state of traditional vaccines as Dr. Hotez is studying?
Yeah, so obviously China leads on that a little bit with Sinopharm and Sinovac. They had some very serious short headline news yesterday saying that their vaccine was 100% protective. We need to see the data. We do have those vaccines in development in Europe and the US. Novavax is developing a traditional vaccine that should be in phase 3 in the next few months. Valneva of Europe is doing that with the killed virus. And of course, you've got Glaxo and Sanofi that will be working on that traditional vaccine starting again in 2021.
Sam, what can you tell us about Moderna? So, this week it was all about Pfizer. It seems that we're expecting some kind of trial analysis from Moderna. Could they surpass Pfizer and give us even better news?
So going beyond 90% would be amazing and therefore unlikely. One case in one group, extra or less, just really changes on these low numbers of cases, the statistics that come out. So if they come out with something in the 80 to 90% range, I will be very happy.
How difficult? I mean, Tom, I can't say enough about how much I love speaking to Sam, also because he knows everything. We were talking about testing yesterday offline and the difference between antigen and PCR and things like that. So, Sam, you're probably one of the few that can explain also, the difference of this vaccine by Pfizer compared to what Moderna is doing. Is it the same basis, but one could be quicker, or is it just from a different premise?
Yeah, so they do have slight differences. The basics are pretty much the same. When you looked at the data in the earlier trials, some differences emerged. I asked Pfizer why they had the slight difference there. They said, we think we know the answer, but we're not ready to discuss it yet. Some minor immunological differences. Whether that means anything with regards to the actual data outcome, time will tell. But I do tell you this, the time difference between the two doses of Pfizer and Moderna are different. One's done within 3 weeks, the other one's done within 4 weeks. Will that make a difference? I don't know.
Sam, I'm looking at the log vectors of deaths of this virus. For example, in New York State, which is doing fine, New York State is doing less than fine right now. Do you, as an expert on this, perceive the deaths now, the hospitalization, and the cases is the same as what we saw 6 months ago, 8 months ago, or is it a whole new construction now?
Yeah, no, Tom, I certainly hope, sincerely hope that it's not the same. Catching the infection is probably just as bad and worse now because so many more people have got it. And you can see by the data, we went from 1 million to 2 million in 44 days and 9 to 10 million in 10 days. So this is in a pretty awful exponential phase in terms of infections. But we've got better at deciding who goes to hospital. Younger people are catching it, which is not good, but at least they don't need hospitalization most of the time. And the deaths are to do with much better clinical care and medical care with a few drugs that have shown some positive help there.
Sam, thank you so much. Sam Fazeli there of Bloomberg Intelligence. Now, coming up in the next hour, we continue tracking COVID-19 with Jason Farley, Johns Hopkins nursing professor. That's at 6:30 a.m. in New York, 11:30 a.m. in London, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Ritika Gupta with your Bloomberg Business Flash. Nissan is forecasting a 28% smaller operating loss for the current fiscal year. That's leading to optimism that the Japanese automaker is regaining its footing after the coronavirus hammered sales. Nissan has been cutting costs, reducing capacity, and restructuring the business. Apollo Global's $2.5 billion bid for Great Canadian is running into investor backlash. Bloomberg has learned that some who own large blocks of the casino company plan to vote against the deal. They believe the takeover offer is too low. An apartment leasing in Manhattan rose for the first time in more than a year. The number of newly signed agreements jumped 33% from a year earlier. But to make the deals, landlords had to offer a number of discounts and freebies, such as 3 months or payment of broker's fees. And that's your latest Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom, Francine.
Ritika, thank you so much. Now, in the last hour, we spoke exclusively with Richard Nade, the Goldman Sachs International Chief Executive. We discussed the future of London, banking amidst the pandemic, and of course, a changing UK and EU landscape.
I think what's really important is that the UK, from a regulatory point of view, from a infrastructure point of view, stays a place that big financial firms want to be to service the global markets, because there's obviously more than the EU. The EU was a very important part of the business being done in London, but it wasn't the only part by any stretch. And I think there's obviously going to be some shift of business from here into the EU. That's what everybody seems to want. So the challenge is how do we grow the global business, and markets continue to innovate. And we had this discussion a few moments ago about the carbon market. Is that a market that can come here? You go back in time, when the atmospherics around China was maybe slightly different. The offshore renminbi market, being situated here. So London has to continue to innovate. There's plenty of opportunities for growth. There's going to be massive infrastructure financing requirements around the world, and if London can play its role in all of that, it'll have a bright future. Clearly, some of the activity, Europe specific, will migrate onto the continent.
When you look at working from home, how much can you help staff in the second lockdown? And actually, are you looking, as some of your peers, in then hiring some kind of WeWork style, buildings for the future?
Yeah, if you go back to March when we were really moving full speed into a work from home environment for the first time, the question was, would it work? And I think we all learned that it could work, and it absolutely did work. And so, going back, we knew that this could function. The question is for how long.
Mr. Doty of Goldman Sachs International, their Chief Executive Officer as well. On the data front, well, let's turn to the market. Red and green. NASDAQ 100, we're sort of reverting back to where we were before the vaccine/election surge. We'll have to see how that plays out here into the weekend, not just Thursday here, but into the weekend as well. I should mention economics, an inflation report in the United States coming up later as well. Coming up on our next hour, really looking forward to this. Ambassador Hormats will join us with all the changes on diplomacy, the changes in America. Robert Hormats. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
better than expected, not only in terms of job creation, but also a sharp fall in the unemployment rate consistent with higher labor force participation. That's really good news.
Overall, the gain was solid, but even while this is a very robust pace of job gains, it's a lot slower than it has been in the summer months.
Great that we saw the job gains we did, but they still are diminished from what they were, of course, back in April and May. And the scarring, the sort of wounds that were created by COVID are beginning to fester.
I would caution people to look at the top line number because I don't think it tells the entire story. Employment relative to population is still well below where we were pre-crisis, and that's because I think that we're going to have some lasting damage.
Depending on what you look at, jobs creation or the unemployment rate, you have different views as to whether the improvement in the labor force is keeping up or slowing down.
for the economy is extraordinarily uncertain and will depend in large part on the success of efforts to keep the virus in check.
They are torturing themselves to explain that they're there, ready, willing, and able.
The Fed has basically done all it can do, with the exception of extreme emergency measures.
This morning, and well, the day after an appearance by the president at the tomb of the unknown soldier, there are too many unknown unknowns. When will the president-elect receive his first intelligence briefing? When will the Pentagon order troops out of Afghanistan? When will Washington understand America's hospitals? They are near full. There is a countdown clock, 69 days to the inauguration, and this is known. Markets, they churned this morning a disinflation report at 8:30. Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Tom Keene in New York. Francine Lacroix in London. And the ramifications, Francine, she's looking at her terminal right now because the news is truly breaking right now, folks. And this goes off of what we heard from Lord Patton yesterday and others, a United Kingdom response to the lessening of liberty in Hong Kong.
Yeah, Tom, I have to say I was quite, not surprised, but I was, quite, let's say, interested in the really strong words that Chris Patton was saying yesterday. Now, we knew this was serious, of course, with the opposition over in Hong Kong resigning all at once, but the way that Lord Patton was talking about it yesterday did make us feel as though the UK government would also be behind him in trying to do something to stop China from continuing further with Hong Kong. And as you're saying, look, it's very clear that because of the relationship with the UK, this has a huge ramification. Mr. Dominic Raab has declared a breach of these Chinese-British treaties on Hong Kong, and you were telling us, Tom, that the UK has also summoned the Chinese ambassador to the Court of St. James over the latest in Hong Kong. The Chinese ambassador to the United Kingdom, there for 10 years now, someone really quite experienced on the London watch, if you will, for Beijing. This story is developing, and we'll have much more on it through the morning, and look to our Hong Kong Bureau for further coverage of this in their early Friday morning. Right now, with our Thursday First Word News, here's Ritika Gupta.
Morning, Tom, Francine. The state of Georgia will conduct a hand recount of ballots for the presidential race. Joe Biden leads President Trump by a slim margin of about 14,000 votes out of roughly 5 million casts. The Trump campaign has alleged there were widespread voting irregularities, but it's offered no proof. President-elect Joe Biden has named a longtime aide Ron Klain to be White House Chief of Staff. Klain played a leading role during the economic and public health crises of the Obama administration. The job is one of the most powerful in Washington. The person is the gatekeeper for the president. Moderna is now poised to take the spotlight on a coronavirus vaccine. The company says its study has accumulated more than 53 infections. That will allow a preliminary analysis of its effectiveness to begin. Moderna didn't predict how long it could take to get an independent monitoring committee to analyze the data. And the International Energy Agency has cut forecasts for global oil demand. New lockdown measures are being imposed around the world, and the agency warns that the vaccine breakthrough won't be enough to quickly revive the markets. Meanwhile, the OPEC Plus alliance may delay an increase in oil production by 3 to 6 months. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. Greatly appreciate that. Renminbi now stronger, 6.62 yuan per U.S. dollar. Sterling 131.90 does not play much off of those Hong Kong, United Kingdom headlines. We have a mixed market, red and green on the screen. The VIX, though, 23.70 really speaks to the adjustment that's out there. A Treasury yield print after Veterans Day yesterday. Bond market closed. We migrate from 0.97 down to 0.94 yield. I'm going to call that normative within the new range that's out there. Other than that, it's a churn, Francine.
Yeah, it's a churn. If you look at what the markets are looking at, I guess they're trying to assess whether they were overheated amid this deteriorating coronavirus situation in many of the large economies I'm looking at, of course, some of the treasuries. I'm looking at 10-year in the U.S. at 0.943. You can look at European stocks. They're down a touch, but really one bright spot was Burberry, which rose as much as 5.8% after sales dropped less than expected, and they're now gaining 2.2%, Tom.
We will touch on the pandemic through the morning. The news flow, as you all know, folks, is just extraordinary here as Francine and I and our team look at economics, finance, investment. There's politics, international relations for all of you, and then there's a pandemic. I want to say one single line before we get to Emily Wilkins, and this from our Bloomberg team on the pandemic that's been exhaustive. New York City's average of people testing positive for the virus is approaching the safety threshold. That'll be something to look for Thursday and into Friday. Right now, she gave us wonderful coverage from Camp Biden during that election night and on for the Thursday. I'll get it out. There it is, Emily. I can't talk this morning, Emily. At Camp Biden in Wilmington, Delaware, Emily Wilkins joins us right now, our congressional reporter. Emily, I want to go to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford, saying enough. Mr. Biden needs an intelligence briefing. What will happen today on that matter?
That is a question that we are all waiting and watching for, Tom. I mean, this basically comes down to one government office, the General Services Administration. They are the ones that have to make the formal call whether or not Biden has won this election. And at this point, officials there have said it's not yet clear. But Senator Langford has said that he will step in and intervene by Friday if that formal call has not been made and Biden has yet to get an intelligence briefing. There are other ways for him to get that briefing than having this formal call from this government agency.
Emily, one of the things I see, and I'm speaking of this from a distance, unlike Kevin Cirilli or Emily Wilkins, is there seems to be a lack of communication within the White House. Is there any communication between Capitol Hill and 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
I think there is some degree of communication, but it's not like everyone is on the same message. We have already seen about half a dozen senators go ahead and congratulate President-elect Biden, saying that it's time for Republicans to work with him. Obviously, the White House is still holding out that Trump has the potential to win this election through courts and legal battle. Although, Tom, from the lawsuits that we're tracking, it doesn't really seem like there's the potential at this point for any of those lawsuits to overturn the results of the election.
How does this end, Emily? I mean, do we really need to wait for all recounts for the power given to the transition? And what do the American people at large really think of this?
So one of the key dates to keep in mind right now is December 8th. By December 8th, any sort of challenges that need to be heard for what the states have counted need to be in, basically, because then on December 14th is when all of these states officially say, hey, this is how many votes we got. This is how many electoral college delegates will be sending for this particular candidate. It sounds kind of wonky, but those are the two dates to really keep in mind when any sort of Trump's legal challenges will have to either be successful or might no longer matter.
Emily, how long does it take to recount?
It depends on the state. It depends on what materials they have. We've already seen a couple states, including Delaware and Wyoming, come out and officialize and certify their results. But we're seeing other states, including Georgia, go into a recount just because the margins are so narrow that that's actually required under their laws. And so that might take a couple weeks. But once again, every state's got those two same deadlines of December 8th and then December 14th.
Emily, how's Camp Biden doing? I mean, you were knee-deep in this out in Wilmington as well, and I guess they've dispersed. Where have they dispersed to, and what's the mood on a given Thursday morning, 69 days to inauguration?
I mean, the Biden campaign is just barreling ahead here as if everything is official. They have, as you mentioned, named Ron Klain to be chief of staff. Yeah. They're filling other top positions. They've gone ahead and spoken with a number of world leaders who acknowledge that Biden has won this election. And so they're really kind of going forward as though they have won. But as we know here, that they're still not getting certain aspects, including these important daily intelligence briefings, because this one government agency has yet to finalize it.
Well, we will see. Emily Wilkins, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated. Our Bloomberg government congressional reporter. We'll see for more announcements today. There is someone to speak to with wonderful experience on this, including the news breaking out of the United Kingdom on the Chinese ambassador has been asked to speak to the British government. Robert Hormats, next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
I clearly will say that it is unfair to the pro-establishment members that once the 90 members left the Legislative Council, then they will become a rubber stamp of the Hong Kong SAR government. That certainly would not happen.
Don't believe it for a moment. Anyway, she doesn't really run Hong Kong anymore. Hong Kong is run by the Chinese Communist Party and its local boss in Hong Kong.
So-called, what is it, self-decision or whatever. And the other is going to the U.S. to ask them to intervene. These are the two big crimes. So you're not talking about petty dissident views.
Of course, chief executive is the puppet of the central government. So as a result, that is the basic argument why we say today is the end of the one country, two system.
We have to protest against this. This is not even rule by law. This is rule by decree. It's a decree handed down on Hong Kong.
I think Hong Kong will remain sort of a vibrant, dynamic, and in every legislation, I think you will expect different voices.
And we thank all of our Hong Kong News Bureau for absolutely definitive coverage yesterday of this history being made in Hong Kong. Right now, we begin a 4-hour conversation with Robert Hormats. Ambassador Hormats, of course, is public service to President Obama and the nation on economics. Mr. Hormats is definitive on our fiscal structure and what it means for our foreign policy. And right now, we rip up the script with Robert Hormats of Tiedemann Advisors to talk simply about the rights and the liberties of the people of Hong Kong. Bob Hormats, there's the headline from the United Kingdom. They have summoned the Chinese ambassador over Hong Kong legislators. What happens when you summon an ambassador?
Well, normally it's an act of opposition to what has been done, or an insistence on clarification of why it was done, or some other way of figuring out what's going to happen next. The British are in a very difficult position because they have, of course, been for a long time the people who ran Hong Kong. They're the ones who made the deal on Hong Kong. On the other hand, the British have a great deal to lose if relations with Beijing go sour. So they have to walk a very fine line to underscore what they consider to be the proper implementation of the agreement they made with the Chinese years ago when Margaret Thatcher was prime minister. But they also want to make sure that they keep good relations with Beijing because it's critically important. Their financial markets depend heavily on Chinese financial business, and they're selling a lot to China. So this is going to be a very complicated conversation that they're going to have between Beijing and London.
Ambassador Leo, former ambassador to Egypt and now 10 years on the watch in London, Ambassador Hormats, shares in common with you an affinity for the Fletcher School at Tufts University. I believe they have a course there on realpolitik. Great. What is the power structure right now for the United States and the United Kingdom to push back against Beijing?
Well, the fact is we have, and the British have very little leverage on Beijing as to what they do in Hong Kong. And, you know, Carrie Lam is still running Hong Kong, but certainly is very heavily dependent on what is told to her by the authorities in Beijing. This is a very complicated situation. Beijing regards anything foreigners say as intervention in internal affairs in China. And Beijing also wants to keep China as a vibrant economy. It's very important to China that Hong Kong thrive. So they're making their views known and in a very assertive way. On the other hand, they're not going to do anything, and they're going to avoid doing anything that disrupts activity, particularly economic and financial activity in Hong Kong. And the British are going to have to demonstrate for their own publics that they're taking a strong stand. On the other hand, they don't want to disrupt relations with Beijing either. It's very important to them economically, and they still want to preserve influence in the higher levels of the government in Beijing.
Ambassador, will the UK find partners in this? So we were just hearing from Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, saying, look, the UK will work with international partners to hold China to its treaty obligations. Who will fight this fight with the UK?
That's a great question and yet to be seen. The reason is that a lot of other countries, first of all, realize that they have very little influence over what China does in Hong Kong these days. And second, they also see China from an economic point of view as vitally important in a world economy that's undergoing great difficulty. They don't want to disrupt economic ties with Beijing or political ties with Beijing. So they have a very fine balancing act that they have to walk. And it's yet to be seen whether a lot of countries who may want to take tougher positions verbally are willing to do anything really that disrupts relations with the authorities in Beijing. And the authorities in Beijing have made it very clear that they don't want other countries to be intervening in this. It's an internal affair for them. And so I'd be very surprised if you get a lot of other countries. Perhaps they may say things, but what they will do that could jeopardize their relations with Beijing, that's another matter, and that's something they're going to have to sort out, and I'm sure they haven't figured it out yet.
Ambassador, was the timing of this very important? This started when China decided to disqualify some Hong Kong legislators because they weren't loyal enough to Beijing. This happened yesterday. Is it significant that it's 3 days after we have, you know, President-elect Biden?
Sure, China does nothing by accident. What they do, they have very strategic thinking in Beijing on time, what they do and when they do it. And I'm sure what they're doing is putting out a message to the United States and other countries, but specifically the United States, saying, we have the authority now in Hong Kong. We have indicated that before. We're taking bolder action to demonstrate that. And if you Americans want to improve relations with Beijing, you will not get involved in this and you will stay out of it. The problem for the United States is, ironically, that you not only have the Hong Kong issue, but you have a lot of Americans on both sides of the aisle saying that we should take tougher positions on China, on a wide range of other issues, Democrats and Republicans. So it's going to be, even if Joe Biden, who I've worked with for years and has had a strong affinity for close relations with China, he's been in a very positive mood. Now he's got pressure internally not to do anything that gets too close to China. So we may go from a sort of a cold peace to a somewhat greater thaw to a degree, but the relations are not going to be the same as they were on Biden, the Biden administration.
Bob Hormats, it's like you're reading our script this morning. We're going to come back and address these timely issues, this bipartisan feeling towards China with Ambassador Hormats, and we'll do that here in a bit. Thrilled that he's with us here this morning with this news out of the United Kingdom. On Balance of Power today, the former governor of the Federal Reserve, the former vice chairman, Daniel Tarullo. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
When you went to Baltimore, you went initially to be an anchor woman, and then didn't quite work out.
Yeah, I got fired.
Well,
demoted. I was
got demoted, but they didn't. They had a contract, so they didn't say goodbye. Yeah. And then, how did you work out to be on a afternoon show where you actually got to be an interviewer? How did that actually happen?
Well, what happened was this is what I now know with age and perspective, that many times getting demoted is an opportunity for something else to show up, or getting fired. You know, lots of people I've interviewed over the years who have these stories about the best thing that ever happened to you. It puts you in the next best place. I was not a good television reporter. I was too emotional. I was making $22,000 a year, and my best friend Gail, who I met there at the time, she was also working there. She said, "Oh my God, you're 22, making $22,000. Imagine when you're 25." Then you're 30. So I'd be making 60 about now. It'd be good, 62. Once I got demoted, they didn't want to pay out my contract. I was making $25,000 a year. They didn't want to pay me the $25,000. Right. So they kept me on and said, "We'll put you on this talk show just to run out your contract."
Generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
I'm David West.
Preston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Rishka Gupta with your Bloomberg Business Flash. China's ByteDance has asked the Trump administration to extend today's deadline to sell its TikTok business in the U.S. In August, President Trump demanded that the app be spun off because of concern about American users' personal information. TikTok has struck a deal to sell part of its business to Oracle and Walmart, but the deal isn't final. Siemens is forecasting a modest increase for growth in 2021 after a tough year for industrial companies due to the pandemic. Still, Europe's biggest engineering firm warns that some coronavirus-related challenges remain that could cause customer investments to lag behind economic growth. And Wells Fargo is considering whether to sell another of its businesses. Bloomberg's learned the bank is exploring the sale of a unit offering store-branded credit cards. Wells Fargo also is gauging interest in other businesses, such as an asset manager and its student loan portfolio. And that's your latest Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom?
Ritika, thanks so much. Equities, bonds, currencies, commodities right now. Again, a split market, red and green on the screen. Back to normal is how I'd put it, with NASDAQ 100 doing better than the Standard & Poor's and the Dow, the VIX under 24. We'd still make note of that. After bonds not open yesterday, we go from 0.97 down to 0.9423%. We go to 4 digits here for Robert Hormats. And I'd note oil finally flat and not surging. Francine?
Yeah, Tom, the rally so far has added some $6 trillion to global stocks this month, and it's definitely slowing today. I guess investors are selling cyclicals, but going into tech shares perceived as safe amid this deteriorating coronavirus situation. So we'll look at some of the double-dip recession calls out there. I know you and I receive a lot of banknotes, so we'll look at them and bring you, of course, the very latest. I did put Burberry in there, Tom, just because sales were down, but better than expected, so shares are up. But coming up on Bloomberg Markets, an exclusive conversation with Mark Ganzi, Colony Capital Chief Executive Officer. That's coming up in the 1 p.m. in New York. That's 6 p.m. in London. And this is Bloomberg.
particularly, sort of technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
Give you a sense of the real-time action, the 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
Bloomberg Surveillance. Good morning, everyone. Tom Keene in New York, Francine Lacroix in London. Lots going on today. Of course, we're looking at the pandemic, which has really taken a most difficult turn in the United States, the politics of the moment. And in the markets, well, the markets are churning today, is how I'd put it, that important inflation report at 8:30. With us now, Ambassador Hormats with Tiedemann Advisors. Robert Hormats, how do you construct a State Department? You've done this not once, but 2 or 3 times as well. Do you sit around a table with a Rolex and go through it? How do you piece together a State Department in 2020?
Great question. First of all, you have to demonstrate that you, as president, and the new Secretary of State, whoever he or she may be, is paying attention to them. I think the State Department morale for the last several years has not been good. Many of them have felt that they have not really been paid sufficient attention to. The quality of the people in the State Department and the Foreign Service, Civil Service is superb. But in order to really have strong morale, you have to feel you're being listened to. So that's the first thing. The second thing is exactly what you say. You go through the records of people, some of whom have worked on the campaign, but you can't limit it to that. You have to go around and say, who are the most capable people for the key jobs? One key job is who deals with China. Another is who deals with these environmental issues that the administration is going to get more involved in. A third is how do you restore alliance support and American support for alliances. Then there are numerous other issues that have to be dealt with in which
Okay, Bob, I don't mean to interrupt, but this is really, really, really important. I'm going to pick on one country, Ukraine. How do we get the trust of Ukraine back, or name any other country?
Ukraine's a great example, Tom, and that is what you want to do is find someone with a lot of experience in dealing with Ukraine, who is trusted on the Hill as someone who knows a lot about Ukraine, but also the Ukrainians as someone who can be an intermediary between their president and their leaders and American leaders. That's going to be very important because that's a signal not just to Ukraine, but to Putin. Putin has to get the signal that the Americans are going to be engaged more extensively in NATO and are not going to sit around while he, Putin, pushes countries like Ukraine and others around. So whoever deals with Russia, like Mike McFaul in the past, others of that ilk and that quality are going to have to be brought in. And it's a signal of quality and American perseverance and American strength in dealing with a country such as Russia. And Ukraine's a very good example of what you need to do. Someone who knows it and someone who's trusted and someone who's very firm in not allowing Ukraine to be pushed around by Moscow.
Ambassador Hormats, because this is a contested election, does it actually hurt the standing of the U.S. worldwide with some of their allies, but also with countries such as China, such as Russia?
I don't think it necessarily does, depending, of course, on the outcome. And I think the key in the outcome is for these other countries to see that popular opinion, that the voter has seemingly, at least to my mind and to those people counting the votes in various states, the voters have come to a decision. There's certainly a lot of people who don't agree with that decision. But in the long run, the strength of American democracy, based on the will of the voters, is going to be seen not only as a signal here, but in other parts of the world. They have long since.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I'm placing a stop on profit for British pound. The price I'm looking for 131.3. 822 802 792. Okay? Stop placed, it will give us nice £500 in profit. 131,792.
He wants to be a leader. It has to be doing it by what happens internally with respect to elections and with respect to dealing with issues that the American people care about. And that's going to be the example. George Kennan, when he was talking about how do you deal with the Soviet Union, this was decades ago, said, make your own system work better and your leadership abroad will be that much easier.
So, well, first of all, I think we do have a scoop actually from Axios saying that President Trump has told friends that he wants to start a digital media company to clobber Fox News. I don't know whether this will have repercussions outside of the U.S., but given what you've just explained to us, what is the most important job that Joe Biden has to fulfill in his administration?
Well, I think he has to do two things. One, he has to demonstrate that the American system works for everyone. And he made an interesting point. He wants to be president not just for the people who voted for him, but for the people who didn't vote for him. And I think pulling the American system together and developing a consensus, at least on a few issues, and getting some legislation through is extremely important. Showing that he can be president for a wide range of people and that he can get results from his presidency, which means working with the Congress on these issues. And he actually in the past did have a good relationship with Mitch McConnell when he was vice president. I remember many meetings where he and McConnell did get together. So we'll see if this can be replicated. It won't be as easy because it's 5 years later, but it's doable. The second, I think, is to demonstrate that America once again wants to be the leader of the free world. And that means working with friends, working with allies, consulting with friends, consulting with allies. That's, I think, a critical element too. I think it's critical at home to demonstrate that we have friends abroad who are working with us, but it's critical abroad to demonstrate that America really wants to work with the leader on environmental issues, on supporting democratic liberal values, liberal with a small L. And I think these are the kinds of things that he's going to have to do. They're basic values.
Bob, we're going to have to leave it there. Robert Hormats, thank you so much. Ambassador Hormats, of course, with his service to the nation with President Obama and a few other presidents as well. In New York City, with our First Word News, here's Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. President Trump suffered 2 setbacks as he tried to claim victory in the state of Arizona. The state's Republican Attorney General told Fox Business it was highly unlikely the president would catch up when remaining ballots are counted. He also said he has found no evidence of widespread fraud that the Trump campaign has alleged. The American pandemic's longest increase in coronavirus infections appears poised to get even longer. The nationwide rise in cases is now in its 9th week. Authorities reported more than 145,000 new cases yesterday, an all-time high, and the 7-day average for deaths has climbed above 1,000 for the first time since August. The British economy expanded the most on record in the 3rd quarter. Growth surged 15.5% after falling almost 20% in the 2nd quarter. Still, the recovery is less than any of its G7 peers. Meanwhile, there's been an increase in coronavirus cases, and British output in September was the worst since April. China and 14 other Asia-Pacific nations are close to a deal on the world's largest free trade agreement. It could be completed this weekend. The partnership also includes Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. It would be the culmination of Beijing's decade-long quest for great economic integration. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thank you so much. Now, joining us next week for Bloomberg's New Economy Forum, we have a great lineup, of course, of newsmakers, policymakers, heads of state. You can watch all of that live on Bloomberg.com, but also follow us on our social channels, Twitter and Facebook. This is Bloomberg.
Okay, as you can see, we closed position on British pound at 131,792. We got £500 in profit.
And how long has it been since Gina Martin Adams joined us with Bloomberg Intelligence and, of course, our chief equity strategist? What we've done is reverted from the mean. That was quite a move higher, Gina, to say the least. What is the official line that you have on the sustainability of Dow 29,157?
Well, look, I think a lot of what we've experienced over the last week is just a reversal of what we had pre-election. We had a pretty significant meltdown in the pre-election week. We recovered in election week, and now we're about right back about where we started. If you look at the S&P 500, it's testing those September peaks. Since September, we've been in sort of a churn, a lot of pre-election nervousness, but also a rotation. Our view is that rotation continues, creating a lot of churn for the equity market, but ultimately, what pulls the market out of this malaise and out of this sideways trend is probably an improvement in earnings growth into 2021. I know there's a lot of uncertainty with respect to that earnings growth. If we can get an economic recovery